German Recon commander, vanished in 1942. 83 years later, his hidden observation post was discovered. Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most extraordinary historical discoveries of the past decade. A story that begins with a crumbling mountainside in the Austrian Alps and ends with a mystery that has haunted military historians for more than 80 years. Pull up a chair, because what you're about to hear is going to rewrite everything you thought you knew about one of the Second World War's most celebrated and enigmatic reconnaissance officers. It is the morning of September 14th, 2024. A survey crew from the Austrian Federal Monuments Authority, the Bundesdenkmalamt, is conducting a routine geological assessment near the village of Steinach-Puig in the Styrian Highlands, approximately 90 kilometers southeast of Salzburg. The team, led by geologist Dr. Martina Hofer and heritage surveyor Klaus Brenner, is mapping subsurface anomalies in a forested ridge known locally as the Eisenkopf. Literally, the Iron Head, a prominence that juts roughly 800 meters above the valley of the Enns River below. The work that morning is methodical and unremarkable. Ground-penetrating radar equipment sweeps back and forth across the frost-hardened soil. Brenner consults his tablet. Hofer adjusts her gear. The pine forest is cold and utterly silent except for the distant cry of a red kite circling overhead. Then, at approximately 10:20 a.m., the radar returns an anomaly. It is not an irregularity in the bedrock. It is not a natural cavity. What the instrument detects, at a depth of roughly 3 meters beneath a heavily overgrown limestone shelf, is a perfectly rectangular structure, roughly 12 meters in length, 4 meters wide, with a ceiling clearance of approximately 2 meters. The walls register as reinforced concrete. The interior shows clear signs of compartmentalization. 3 distinct chambers separated by what appear to be interior partition walls. Brenner photographs the readout on his tablet and turns to Hofer. "That's not natural," he says simply. Within 48 hours, a joint excavation team has been assembled, drawing personnel from the Austrian Archaeological Service, the University of Graz Department of Military History, and advisors from the German Federal Archives in Koblenz. A discrete clearance perimeter is established around the site. The local forestry authority is quietly notified. No public statement is released. Excavation begins on September 19th, 2024. The entrance to the structure, concealed beneath decades of soil accumulation, moss, and pine root, is eventually located on the northern face of the limestone shelf, oriented deliberately away from the valley and any line of sight from below. The doorway is sealed with a steel blast door, approximately 4 centimeters thick, badly corroded but structurally intact. The locking mechanism, a German military Schlüsselwerk model 1940, has rusted solid, but the forensic engineers break the seal in under 3 hours. What greets them on the other side stops the team cold. The interior of the structure, which investigators will come to designate as Beobachtungsposten Eisenkopf, or Observation Post Iron Head, is essentially frozen in time. Wooden map tables, rotted but structurally recognizable, a generator housing bolted to the southern wall, steel shelf brackets still bearing the rusted remains of equipment cases. And on the central table, held beneath a cracked glass cover, a collection of documents so perfectly preserved by the cold and the airtight seal that forensic handlers initially refused to believe their age. Among those documents, investigators find a leather-bound field logbook. Inside the cover, stamped in faded black ink, is a name and designation. Hauptmann Ernst Wilhelm Kremer, Aufklärungsgruppe 122, Heeresgruppe Süd 1942. Captain Ernst Wilhelm Kremer, a man the Wehrmacht death registry officially recorded as killed in action on October 19, 1942, near Stalingrad. A man whose family received a death notification signed by his commanding general. A man buried, supposedly, in a collective grave at the German War Cemetery in Rossachka, outside Volgograd, Russia. But here, in a sealed bunker in the Austrian Alps, more than 1,400 kilometers from where he supposedly died, is evidence that tells an entirely different story. And what investigators find deeper in that bunker? The maps, the coded correspondence, the civilian identity papers, the money, will shake the historical record to its core. If you want to see everything investigators uncovered inside that bunker, make sure you hit the like button right now and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. Because stories like this one connect us across every border and every time zone. We're going to explore this mystery together, all the way from that mountainside in Austria to the farthest corners of a globe that men like Ernst Kremer once mapped from the sky. Let's begin. To understand the significance of what investigators found inside that bunker, you need to understand the man whose name was stamped inside that logbook. Because Ernst Wilhelm Kremer was not simply a soldier. He was, by any honest assessment, one of the most gifted reconnaissance officers the German military produced in the entire course of the Second World War, and his disappearance in October of 1942 had remained one of the quieter, less examined mysteries of the Eastern Front for more than 8 decades. Ernst Wilhelm Kremer was born on March 3, 1908 in Regensburg, Bavaria, the second son of a civil engineer named Friedrich Kremer and his wife, Elisabetha, née Waldmann. He was raised in comfortable, educated middle-class surroundings, with access to books, maps, and his father's considerable library of geographic and technical literature. By the time he completed his secondary education at the König Wilhelm Gymnasium in Regensburg in 1926, he had developed an obsessive fascination with cartography, aerial perspective, and what he called, in a letter preserved in the Bavarian State Archives, the geometry of the hidden landscape. He enrolled at the Technische Hochschule München in the autumn of 1926, studying surveying and geodesy, the science of precisely measuring and understanding the Earth's geometric shape and physical properties. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional student. His thesis, submitted in 1931, dealt with the use of oblique aerial photography to supplement traditional land survey methods, a subject that was, in 1931, considered somewhat academic. Within a decade, it would become central to modern warfare. Kremer joined the Reichswehr, the pre-Nazi German military, in 1932, following the path of many young, technically trained graduates who saw military service as a path toward professional stability in Depression-era Germany. He was commissioned as a lieutenant and posted to a cartographic unit, where his surveying background made him an immediate asset. He was promoted to Oberleutnant in 1935. The same year, the newly reconstituted Wehrmacht dramatically expanded its reconnaissance capabilities under the direction of Colonel Werner von Fritsch. By 1937, Kremer was attached to the Lufthansa-affiliated aerial survey program operating under partial military direction, training pilots and observers in the use of the Rheinbildner RB-12-7, the German military's standard aerial camera system of the period. It is here that his reputation began to solidify. Fellow officers described him as meticulous to the point of obsession, capable of reading an aerial photograph with an almost supernatural precision. General der Flieger Hans-Eugen Stumpf, in a post-war testimony recorded at Nuremberg in 1946, described Kremer as the finest photograph interpreter I ever encountered, a man who could look at a square kilometer of Russian steppe from 1,500 meters altitude and tell you not just what was there, but what had been there the week before. Kremer was promoted to Hauptmann captain in March of 1940 and assigned to command Staffel II of Aufklärungsgruppe 122, the 122nd Long-Range Reconnaissance Group, then operating out of aerodromes in occupied Poland. This unit, designated Aufgol, GR 122 in official Wehrmacht records, was one of the most highly specialized reconnaissance formations on the Eastern Front. Flying modified Junkers Ju-88D aircraft equipped with long-range fuel tanks and the Reihenbildner RB-50-30 camera system, they ranged hundreds of kilometers behind Soviet lines, photographing rail junctions, supply depots, troop concentrations, and defensive fortifications. Between the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June of 1941 and the autumn of 1942, Kremer personally led or directed more than 340 individual reconnaissance missions over Soviet territory. His photographic intelligence work contributed directly to planning for the Fall Blau, Case Blue offensive of summer 1942, the massive German drive toward the Volga River and the Caucasus oil fields that would culminate in the catastrophe of Stalingrad. Declassified files from the German military archives in Freiburg, released in 2019 following a review by the Joint German-Russian Historical Commission, confirm that 17 specific target assessments in the lead-up to Fall Blau bore Kremer's photographic intelligence fingerprints. He was decorated with the Iron Cross First Class in November 1941 and was nominated, though never formally awarded due to the circumstances of his disappearance, for the German Cross in Gold in late September 1942. But the picture that emerges of Kremer from personal correspondence, post-war testimony, and the documents now recovered from the Eisenkopf bunker is not simply the portrait of a loyal servant of the Nazi military machine. The picture is considerably more complicated. Kremer was not a member of the NSDAP, the Nazi Party. This was, by 1942, increasingly unusual for an officer of his rank and visibility. Several colleagues later recalled that he was privately contemptuous of party functionaries who inserted themselves into military operations, and at least 2 surviving letters, written to his wife Hildegard, née Schäfer, in the period between June and August of 1942, contained carefully coded language that historians have interpreted as profound disillusionment with the direction of the war and with the regime that was prosecuting it. Those letters take on a particular poignancy when you understand what happened to Hildegard Kremer. In late July 1942, while Ernst was flying reconnaissance missions over the Don Steppe, an RAF bombing raid struck the residential district of Cologne's Nips Quarter, where Hildegard and their 2 daughters, Anna, aged 9, and Lieselot, aged 6, were living with Hildegard's parents. The house took a direct hit. Hildegard, Anna, Lieselot, and both grandparents were killed instantly. The notification reached Kremer at his forward operating base near Kharkov on August 3, 1942, delivered by a signals officer who later recalled that Kremer read the telegram, folded it precisely in half, placed it in his breast pocket, and returned to his briefing without a word. He never spoke publicly about their deaths, but the man who emerged from that grief, isolated, technically brilliant, and now profoundly unburdened of any reason to return to a Germany at peace, was a different man from the one who had received the telegram. 3 months later, on October 19, 1942, Captain Ernst Wilhelm Kremer was officially declared killed in action near Stalingrad. His aircraft, a Ju-88D bearing the designation 4U+DH, was reported missing after a reconnaissance mission east of the Volga River. No wreckage was ever located. No body was ever recovered. The death certificate, signed by Generalmajor Friedrich von Paulus in his capacity as commanding officer of the 6th Army, just weeks before Paulus himself would be encircled inside Stalingrad, listed the cause of death as shot down by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. The official record says Ernst Wilhelm Kremer died in the skis above the Volga steppe in October of 1942. But the evidence locked inside a mountain in the Austrian Alps for 83 years, tells a different story entirely. October 12, 1942, a forward airfield near Pitomnik, approximately 22 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The situation on the Eastern Front has been deteriorating for weeks. The Great Summer Offensive that was supposed to shatter Soviet resistance and secure the oil fields of the Caucasus has bogged down in the rubble of a city, Stalingrad, that neither side can now afford to lose. The streets have become a grinding, close-quarters nightmare. German logistics are stretched to their absolute limit. The Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, is being planned in complete secrecy, though German intelligence has begun picking up fragmentary signs that something enormous is coming. It is in this context, this atmosphere of gathering catastrophe and institutional distraction, that someone within the Wehrmacht reconnaissance network begins making preparations that have nothing to do with the war effort. The documents recovered from the Eisenkopf bunker include a remarkable piece of evidence: a series of encoded planning notes, written on standard Wehrmacht signal paper, covering the period between October 5th and October 17th, 1942. These notes, deciphered in full by cryptographic analysts at the University of Vienna's Department of Historical Linguistics in January 2025, using a modified version of a German field cipher system designated Feldchiffrierschlüssel 41C, lay out, in operational terms, what investigators have come to call Plan Steinadler, Operation Golden Eagle. The notes are not signed, but the handwriting has been positively matched through analysis conducted by Dr. Franziska Mayer of the Vienna Federal Institute for Materials Testing, comparing the samples against authenticated documents from the Bavarian State Archives, to Ernst Wilhelm Kremer. The probability of a different author, according to Dr. Mayer's March 2025 forensic report, is less than 3%. What Plan Steinadler describes is an escape. October 14, 1942, 6 a.m., Pitomnik Airfield. According to the decoded notes, this is the day the preparations enter their active phase. Kremer has used his position as reconnaissance commander to authorize a supply flight to the German-controlled airfield at Dnepropetrovsk, a city in occupied Ukraine, approximately 700 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The authorization is logged in the airfield's departure register, a copy of which was uncovered in the German Federal Military Archives during a parallel document search in November 2024. The official purpose of the flight is listed as transport of photographic intelligence materials. The aircraft assigned is a Junkers Ju-52 transport, designation WL+DA. On board that flight, alongside the crated camera equipment, is a second set of cargo, 2 steel document cases, locked with civilian padlocks rather than military ones, and stowed in the cargo bay without formal manifest entry. Investigators believe these cases contain the financial resources and documentation that would fund the escape network. An estimated 42 gold Reichsmark coins of various denominations, 14 sets of partially completed civilian identity papers sourced from occupied territories, and at least 1 set of fully completed papers in the name of Friedrich Baumann, civil surveyor, born April 7, 1908, in Augsburg. The name Friedrich Baumann, it will appear again many times. October 16, 1942, 3 p.m., Dnepropetrovsk, occupied Ukraine. The Ju-52 has arrived. Kremer is not on board. He has remained at Pitomnik for 2 more days, performing his duties with characteristic meticulousness, ensuring that nothing about his behavior raises alarm. Declassified signals logs show he personally authorized 2 reconnaissance missions on October 15th and attended a planning conference on the morning of October 16th. But the document cases have been collected from Dnepropetrovsk by a contact. The identity of that contact becomes one of the central questions of the modern investigation. Evidence points to a man named Oberfeldwebel Hans Richter, a supply sergeant attached to Luftflotte 4's Rear Area Logistics Command, stationed at Dnepropetrovsk. Richter's Wehrmacht personnel file, obtained from the German military archives, shows him as discharged from service in April 1943 for medical reasons, an unusually swift and poorly documented separation. His post-war civilian registration records, traced through Austrian Interior Ministry archives by investigator Dr. Bernd Osterhagen of Graz University in late 2024, show him re-emerging in the Austrian town of Bad Aussee in the Salzkammergut region under the name Hans Reiter, a detail that no previous researcher had ever connected to Kremer's case. October 17, 1942, 11 p.m., Pittamnik Airfield. The next-to-last entry in Kremer's recovered field logbook reads in full, Letzte Aufzeichnung, morgen nichts mehr. Final entry, tomorrow nothing more. October 18, 1942, 4:30 a.m., the airfield at Pittamnik. According to the decoded planning notes and reconstructed flight records, Kremer is aboard a reconnaissance Ju-88D aircraft 4U+DH for what appears to be a routine pre-dawn mission east of Stalingrad. The mission is logged. The takeoff is witnessed. The aircraft rises into darkness and turns east. It never comes back. At the Soviet anti-aircraft reporting station near Leninskaya, 50 kilometers east of Stalingrad, operators log no contacts with German aircraft during the relevant window. This information, buried in Soviet Air Defense Archive records declassified in Moscow in 2016, was noted by at least one Russian historian at the time, but never cross-referenced with the Kremer case because, quite simply, no one had reason to question the official account. What the planning notes suggest, corroborated by fuel consumption calculations performed by aviation historian Dr. Klaus Weber of the Deutsches Museum in Munich in February 2025, is that 4U+DH never flew east at all. The aircraft's actual route, extrapolated from its known fuel capacity and the range envelope of the Ju-88D, points west and south, toward Romania, toward Hungary, toward the first waypoint of Plan Steinadler. The fate of the aircraft itself remains unconfirmed, but based on a Romanian Aviation Authority report from 1943, a report examining an unregistered aircraft wreck found near the town of Buzău in Wallachia in February 1943, investigators believe 4U+DH was deliberately crashed in a remote area after landing, stranding its two-man crew. The crew, Lieutenant Alfred Peschke and Unteroffizier Georg Mayer, are listed as missing in action in Wehrmacht records. Neither man's fate has ever been determined. The ethical weight of this detail is something investigators have wrestled with openly. October 18th to October 24th, 1942, the escape corridor. Plan Steinadler unfolds across 6 days. Using the decoded notes and corroborating evidence from multiple national archives, investigators have reconstructed the following route. From the aircraft's estimated landing point in eastern Romania, Kremer moves by road, the notes reference, the hired wagon, Buzău to Ploiești, to the city of Ploiești, hub of Romania's oil industry, and a place swarming with German military and civilian contractors, where a man with German papers and a German accent attracts no particular attention. Here, under the alias Friedrich Baumann, he boards a commercial train on October 20th, 1942, traveling northwest through the Carpathian passes toward the Hungarian border at Pradil. He crosses into Hungary the following day. Hungarian border records from 1942, held in the Magyar Nemzeti Levéltár, the Hungarian National Archive in Budapest, include a Friedrich Baumann, civil surveyor, crossing the frontier at Pradil on October 21st, 1942. This entry was identified in November 2024 by archival researcher Dr. Agata Novak of Budapest's Central European University. From Hungary, the route continues northwest through Vienna, then the capital of the incorporated territory of Ostmark, teeming with military traffic and administrative confusion, and from Vienna, southwest into the Salzkammergut alpine region of Styria, to a mountain called the Eisenkopf, to a bunker that had been built months before anyone went missing. The Eisenkopf bunker is fully opened and cataloged by investigators over a period of 17 days, from September 19th through October 5th, 2024. The lead investigative team is directed by Dr. Heinrich Voss, professor of modern military history at the University of Innsbruck, with forensic support from the Austrian Institute for Archaeological Sciences and Documentary Analysis, provided by specialists from the German Federal Archives and the International Tracing Service, the ITS, in Bad Arolsen. The scale of what they find is staggering. The bunker's 3 chambers serve distinct purposes. The first chamber nearest the entrance is the operational space, map table, instrument shelving, a plotting board still mounted on the north wall showing a hand-drawn topographic survey of the surrounding valley system. The second chamber is a living space, a folding cot, a cooking alcove with a rusted spirit stove, a wooden storage chest, and most critically, a built-in document safe bolted directly into the concrete wall. The third chamber is an equipment room, containing the rusted remains of a radio transceiver, a hand-cranked electrical generator, and what forensic experts identify as a photographic development station, trays, chemical bottles long evaporated, and a light-proof canopy frame, consistent with portable darkroom equipment manufactured in Germany between 1938 and 1943. The document safe in the second chamber takes 3 days to open. It is a Henschel Model S43 document safe, rated against fire and water penetration, with a combination lock mechanism that is no longer functioning. When technicians finally breach it on September 22, 2024, they find the following items, cataloged in the official Austrian Federal Monuments Authority inventory report dated November 14, 2024. Item 1. The leather-bound field logbook bearing Kremer's name and unit designation. 187 pages of handwritten entries, spanning the period from June 1941 through what appears to be late 1944. The final dated entry reads simply, Winter 1944, the passes are closing again. Item 2. A cylindrical map case containing 14 individually rolled topographic maps of the Salzkammergut and Styrian Highlands region, annotated in a precise technical hand. Several of these maps show marked routes, dotted lines descending from the ridge toward the valley, and designated waypoints labeled only with single-letter codes. Item 3. A leather wallet containing 2 sets of identity documents. The first set is in the name of Friedrich Baumann, already familiar from the planning notes. The second set, apparently prepared later, based on the document paper dating conducted by Dr. Werner Haas of the Vienna University of Technology in December 2024, is in the name of Franz Wegner, timber merchant, born February 12, 1908, in Linz. Item 4. 11 personal letters, all in sealed envelopes addressed to H.K. Regensburg, an address subsequently identified as the home of Kremer's surviving sister, Marta Kremer, who lived in Regensburg until her death in 1991. The letters are undated, but are written on a variety of paper types suggesting composition over multiple years. Item 5. A steel box containing 57 gold coins, 31 gold mark pieces of 20 mark denomination from the Imperial German period, 14 Austrian 100 Kronen coins from pre-1918 stock, and 12 Swiss 20-franc Vreneli coins, the latter being a standard currency of the black market and underground financial systems of occupied Europe throughout the war years. Item 6. A personal photograph, approximately 10 by 13 centimeters, showing a man in civilian clothes standing in front of an unidentified alpine building. The man is facing slightly away from the camera. He appears to be in his mid-30s to early 40s. He is wearing a surveyor's vest. This photograph becomes one of the most contested pieces of evidence in the investigation. Facial recognition analysis is performed in January 2025 by the Forensic Image Analysis Laboratory of the Austrian Ministry of the Interior, using a three-dimensional modeling technique that compares the photographic subject against authenticated wartime photographs of Ernst Kremer held at the German military archives. The analysis returns a probability match of 87.3%, high enough to be considered indicative, but below the 92% threshold generally required for definitive identification in Austrian legal proceedings. Dr. Voss, in an interview with the journal Militärgeschichtliche Zeitschrift published in February 2025, describes the figure as compelling but not conclusive, consistent with the hypothesis that this is Kremer, and inconsistent with it being anyone else for whom we have a photographic record. The letters to HK, the sister Marta, under her married initial, though investigators initially consider several alternatives, are subjected to full forensic analysis. Handwriting comparison against the authenticated Kremer documents from the Bavarian State Archives produces a match probability of 94.6%, according to the February 2025 report of Dr. Franziska Mayer. The letters are almost certainly written by Ernst Kremer. Their contents are extraordinary. The letters do not identify the writer by name. They do not give addresses or dates in any direct form. They are written in a style that appears deliberately ambiguous, references to the work continuing, the mountain keeping its silence, the cold staying good for the preservation of things. But they contain personal details, references to a shared childhood memory of a particular bridge over the Danube near Regensburg, to a joke between siblings about their father's mustache, to the names of family friends who would have been known only to the Kremer family, that make their authorship essentially beyond reasonable doubt. One letter, evidently written several years after the others based on paper analysis, contains a sentence that has become the most cited line in all the subsequent coverage of this case. In full, it reads, "The official story was necessary for everyone, for me, for the machinery, and perhaps even for those who were never going to forgive what the machinery had done. I have chosen a different ending." Investigators spend 3 months tracing the chain of evidence backward and forward. The German Federal Archives military section in Freiburg provides copies of Kremer's complete personnel file, mission logs, and the original death notification documentation. The International Tracing Service in Bad Arolsen contributes records pertaining to post-war displaced person registrations in the Styrian and Upper Austrian regions that include 2 references to a Franz Wegner. One, in a refugee transit record from Bad Ischl dated September 1945, and one, in a local police registration record from the town of Grundlsee, dated March 1946. Grundlsee, a village on the shore of the Grundlsee, the first of the 3 connected alpine lakes of the Salzkammergut, less than 14 kilometers from the Eisenkopf Ridge. When investigators request access to the Grundlsee Municipal Registry, held in fragile but largely intact condition at the Styrian Regional Archive in Graz, they find that a Franz Wegner, timber merchant, registered as resident in Grundlsee from April 1946 until his apparent departure from the registration rolls in November 1952. His registered address is a house called Steinerhof, the Stone House, on the eastern lakeside. Tax records from the period, recovered from the Austrian Federal Finance Archive, show him as a small-scale land surveying contractor, paying modest but consistent taxes on a modest but consistent income. The Steinerhof no longer exists. The building was demolished in 1967 following a structural assessment that deemed it unsound. But a 1951 land survey photograph, taken for the Austrian Federal Land Registration Program and archived in Vienna, shows a compact stone house at the correct location on the eastern lake shore. And in the foreground of that photograph, almost incidentally, a man is visible near the property's fence line, turned slightly away from the camera, dressed in working clothes. The Forensic Image Analysis Laboratory returns the same verdict on this photograph as they do for the bunker photograph. 87.1% probability of match to Ernst Wilhelm Kremer. Two photographs, two anonymous men at two separate locations, both matching the missing German officer at a probability that edges towards certainty without quite crossing the legal threshold. The evidence, taken together, presents a picture that Dr. Voss describes in his comprehensive report to the Austrian Federal Ministry of Culture and Science, submitted in March 2025, as follows. We cannot state with absolute scientific certainty that Ernst Wilhelm Kremer survived the war, assumed a false identity, and lived in the Austrian Salzkammergut for at least a decade after the armistice. But we can state that every piece of physical evidence we have recovered is consistent with that conclusion, and that no piece of evidence we have examined is inconsistent with it. What makes the Eisenkopf discovery truly extraordinary, and what elevates it from the story of one individual's disappearance to something of far broader historical significance, is what the decoded planning notes and the map collection reveal about the infrastructure that made Ernst Kremer's escape possible. Because Plan Steinedler was not improvised. It was not the desperate, solitary scheme of a single man seizing an unexpected opportunity. It was the product of an organized network, a network that investigators now believe facilitated the escape of at least a dozen other individuals from the Eastern Front between 1942 and 1944. The 14 annotated topographic maps from the Eisenkopf document safe, when analyzed in conjunction with the decoded planning notes by Dr. Voss's team working alongside Dr. Claudia Reinhardt of the Austrian Institute for Contemporary History in Vienna, reveal a system of considerable sophistication. The single-letter waypoints marked on the maps correspond, through a straightforward substitution system also identified in the planning notes, to a network of locations distributed across the alpine regions of Austria, Bavaria, and northern Italy. Investigators have positively identified 11 of the 14 waypoints. Waypoint A, the Grundlsee-Steinerhof itself, the end point of the primary escape corridor from the east. Waypoint B, a farm in the Aussierland Valley southwest of Bad Aussee, owned in 1942 by one Ludwig Hackel, a former First World War veteran and black market supplier, whose post-war financial records show unexplained cash deposits between 1942 and 1945. Waypoint C, a Catholic monastery near the town of Edmont, approximately 40 kilometers west of Steinach-Puig. The monastery's wartime guest records, preserved in the diocesan archive of the Bishop of Graz-Seco and accessed by investigators in January 2025, show a pattern of civilian visitors registered under obviously generic names in the autumn and winter months of 1942, 1943, and 1944. Waypoints D through G trace a route through the Austrian-Bavarian borderlands toward Berchtesgaden and the Inn Valley, a corridor well documented in other escape network investigations as a standard axis of movement for individuals seeking to transit between Germany and Austria under false civilian papers. Waypoints H through K mark a southern branch of the network extending through the Carnic Alps into the Friuli region of northeastern Italy, at the time under German military administration, and toward the Adriatic coast near Trieste. This southern branch is where the investigation takes its most disturbing turn. Among the decoded planning notes is a single entry, designated in the document as an operational reference, suggesting it was not Kremer's own work, but information he had received from the network, that refers to a Waypoint K contact by the initials FS, and describes this contact as the one who arranges the onward passage, the Spanish connection, the boats from Trieste. The Spanish connection, the boats from Trieste. These are phrases that will be immediately recognizable to any historian familiar with the post-war escape networks that carried Nazi war criminals and SS officers out of Europe. Networks that historians have collectively designated by the now standard term Ratlins. The Ratlins, plural, because there were several overlapping systems, operated through the immediate post-war years to facilitate the emigration of thousands of former German and Austrian officials, military officers, and SS personnel to countries outside the reach of Allied occupation and denazification. The two primary routes ran through Switzerland and Spain, or through Italy and the Vatican-adjacent network operated by Bishop Awahudal and others, towards South America and the Middle East. The critical discovery at Eisenkopf is this. The network that Kremer used appears to have been fully operational before the war ended, as early as autumn 1942, and it appears to have been integrated with, or at least connected to, the same infrastructure that would later facilitate the more famous post-war escapes. Among those known to have used the Italian Adriatic corridor in the post-war period are individuals including former SS Hauptsturmführer Eduard Rashman, the so-called Butcher of Riga, and elements of the networks later investigated by Simon Wiesenthal's Documentation Center in Vienna. Whether the wartime network that sheltered Kremer was directly organized by any named war criminal, or whether it emerged organically from existing black market and anti-Nazi resistance infrastructure that was subsequently captured and repurposed, is a question the current evidence cannot definitively answer. But the connection to the Ratlin infrastructure, even if only structural, even if only in the sense of shared geography and shared methods, forces investigators to confront an uncomfortable question. Was the network that sheltered a disillusioned reconnaissance captain also sheltering individuals with far darker records? The annotated maps cannot speak, but their silence is louder than the investigators had expected. The network's financial underpinning is easier to trace. The gold coins recovered from the Eisenkopf safe represent only a fraction of the resources the planning notes reference. The notes describe a cash reserve, distributed across at least 3 waypoints, holding an estimated combined value of 800,000 Reichsmarks in gold and foreign currency as of October 1942. For context, this is roughly equivalent to the annual salary of approximately 200 Wehrmacht officers, an enormous sum that could only have been assembled through systematic diversion of military resources over a significant period. The notes also reference photographic materials of operational value, a phrase that forensic document analysts interpret as a possible reference to reconnaissance photography of strategic locations, held as leverage or as trade goods with intelligence value. The full implications of this phrase remain under investigation. The trail of Franz Wegner, timber merchant, resident of Grundlsee, goes cold in November of 1952. The municipal registration roll simply notes his departure from the district, a standard entry, unremarkable in the context of post-war Austria, where population movement was constant and administrative record-keeping was still recovering from wartime disruption. No forwarding address is recorded. No customs departure record corresponding to the Wegner identity has been located in Austrian federal archives. Where Ernst Kremer went after 1952 is the question that investigators openly describe as the most tantalizing and least resolved aspect of the Eisenkopf investigation. The evidence offers several threads, none of them conclusively tied. The 11 letters found in the Eisenkopf safe, addressed to HK in Regensburg, were never sent, they remain sealed, their contents unread by their intended recipient until investigators opened them in late 2024. This suggests one of two things. Either Kremer abandoned the cache and moved on too quickly to retrieve them, or, more plausibly, in Dr. Voss's assessment, he chose not to send them precisely because maintaining any communication link, however indirect, was a risk he was no longer willing to take after a decade of cautious concealment. The second Wegner identity papers, the set dated later than the Baumann papers, lead to a further thread. A Franz Wegner appears in the Argentine consular registration records for the city of Rosario, Santa Fe province, in November 1953, 1 year after the Austrian registration trail ends. The Argentine record is fragmentary. Argentina's immigration and residency records from the post-war period are notoriously incomplete, a consequence of both the scale of immigration during the Perón era and the deliberate administrative looseness that allowed so many former European officials to establish new lives there. But the Rosario entry lists a profession, land surveyor and cartographic consultant, that is almost too perfectly consistent to be coincidental. A land surveyor, in a province of the Argentine Pampas, whose agricultural expansion during the 1950s created significant demand for precisely the professional skills that Ernst Wilhelm Kremer had spent his entire adult life developing. Dr. Voss's team requested cooperation from the Argentine National Archives in Buenos Aires in January 2025. The response, received in March 2025, confirmed the existence of the Rosario registration, but could provide no further documentation. A search of Santa Fe provincial property records, conducted in collaboration with researchers at the Universidad Nacional del Litoral in Rosario, located a land parcel registered to a Franz Wegner in the rural district of San Lorenzo between 1955 and approximately 1968, at which point the records become inconsistent. The year 1968 is significant. It corresponds, with an eerie precision, to the year that Kremer would have been 60 years old, an age at which a man who had been living under sustained psychological pressure for 26 years, whose wife and children were dead, whose country had been destroyed and rebuilt in a form he had deliberately separated himself from, might have made decisions that leave no further documentary trace. One witness account, discovered by Dr. Voss's team through an appeal published in the Argentinisches Tageblatt, the German-language newspaper of Buenos Aires, in January 2025, comes from an elderly man named Alberto Vogel, born 1941 in Rosario to German immigrant parents, who recalls a childhood neighbor in the San Lorenzo district as a very quiet German man, very precise, who drew maps for the farmers and never spoke about Germany and had no family that I ever saw. Vogel recalls this neighbor departing the area sometime in the late 1960s. He simply was not there one morning, and that he carried with him only a single leather satchel. The leather satchel, the image of a man with a single piece of luggage departing a life built on concealment and silence. There is no death record, under any of Kremer's known aliases, in the archives of Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, or Chile for the period 1960 through 1990 that investigators have been able to match. No deathbed confession has emerged. No late-life photograph has been positively identified. The final chapter of Ernst Wilhelm Kremer's life, assuming he survived the 1950s and 1960s in South America, remains unwritten, at least in any archive accessible to current investigators. The gap where his story ends is, in its own way, a kind of answer. Some men escape history entirely. Some escapes are so complete that even the most meticulous modern investigation can only follow the shadow of a man to a point, and then watch it dissolve into the landscape. He spent his entire professional life learning to read from altitude. The discovery of the Eisenkopf observation post forces a reckoning that historians and ethicists have been navigating carefully in the months since the initial announcement. Ernst Wilhelm Kremer was not, by the evidence available, a war criminal in the conventional sense. He was not a member of the SS. He held no command authority over prisoner treatment, forced labor, or civilian populations. His work was aerial reconnaissance, technically demanding, professionally specialized, and in the direct service of military operations that caused enormous destruction and death. But the specific form of that service, identifying targets, mapping terrain, providing intelligence, sits at a remove from the direct perpetration of atrocity that characterized the worst of the Nazi system. This distinction matters morally, even as it refuses to resolve cleanly. The photographic intelligence Kremer provided contributed to the planning of Fall Blau, the offensive that dragged hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to their deaths at Stalingrad and inflicted catastrophic casualties on the Soviet population of the Volga and Don regions. The targets he helped identify and assess included Soviet industrial facilities that were subsequently bombed, Soviet defensive positions whose mapping facilitated assaults, Soviet supply lines whose destruction contributed to the starvation and displacement of civilian populations. He was, in the language of military law, a lawful combatant. He was also a cog in a machine of extraordinary destructive capacity. The ethical question his escape raises is therefore not the simple one, did a monster evade justice? But a considerably more uncomfortable one. Does an ordinary soldier, technically competent and personally non-ideological, who found himself serving a criminal regime and chose personal survival over accountability when the regime began to collapse, bear a responsibility that he was obligated to answer for? Simon Wiesenthal, who spent decades hunting the architects of genocide through networks not entirely unlike the one that sheltered Kremer, drew a careful distinction between those who gave the orders, those who personally executed the crimes, and those who served the machine from within its technical and professional strata. That distinction does not absolve the third category, but it does calibrate the gravity of their debt differently. The victims who received no justice because of Kremer's escape are not, individually, the direct victims of his specific actions in the way that the victims of an SS death squad commander are the direct victims of his orders, but they are part of a wider population whose right to historical accounting, to acknowledgement, to a record, to the knowledge that those who served the machinery of their destruction answered in some form for that service, was denied by his choice to vanish. That denial is not trivial. It is not nothing. It is a form of harm done to historical memory and to the possibility of moral completion that no amount of personal suffering, even the genuine suffering of losing a wife and 2 children to Allied bombs, can fully offset. What is perhaps most striking about the Eisenkopf evidence is what it reveals about the scale of the escape phenomenon. Kremer was one man. The network he used served at least a dozen others. The broader infrastructure connected to the Ratlins served thousands. The organized, resourced, systematically operated nature of these escapes speaks to an institutional failure of accountability that was not incidental but, in some measure, deliberate, the product of a post-war world in which Cold War strategic priorities frequently took precedence over the demands of historical justice. How many Kremers, technically skilled, professionally useful men with the means and the motive and the connections to disappear, found their way into new lives under false names while the world rebuilt itself around their absence? The honest answer is that we do not know. The honest answer is that we are, even now, still finding their observation posts, their hidden safes, their encoded letters to sisters who never received them. The discovery at Eisenkopf is, in this sense, not just the story of one man's escape. It is a window into the vast, only partially illuminated territory of history that refused to stay buried, even when buried it was, for 83 years, beneath 3 meters of alpine soil and a steel blast door 4 centimeters thick. October 2025, the Eisenkopf Ridge, Styrian Highlands. Exactly 1 year after the blast door was first opened, the site designated Beobachtungsposten Eisenkopf is formally declared a protected historical monument under Austrian federal heritage law. The Austrian Federal Monuments Authority, in cooperation with the University of Innsbruck and the regional government of Styria, announces a phased conservation program that will stabilize the bunker's structure, install climate-controlled preservation systems for the remaining artifacts, and, in the medium term, open the site to guided public access as part of a memorial and educational pathway tracing the history of the Eastern Front and its long aftermath. On the morning of the designation ceremony, a quiet, deliberately understated event attended by Dr. Voss and his research team, representatives of the federal government, and several historians from Germany and Austria, the ridge is cold and still. The pines are heavy with the year's first early frost. The valley of the Enns lies far below, the river a silver thread in the October light. A small bronze plaque is set into the limestone shelf above the bunker entrance. It reads in German, in English, and in Russian. This site was concealed for 83 years. It was found because history, however carefully buried, does not stay buried forever. The artifacts recovered from the Eisenkopf safe are now held at the Austrian National Archive in Vienna, where they are available to qualified researchers under the terms of the Federal Heritage Protection Order. The field logbook, all 187 pages of it, has been digitized in full and submitted to the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure's central database. The 11 undelivered letters to HK in Regensburg have been deposited with the Bavarian State Archives, with a note that they may be claimed by documented descendants of the Kremer family. As of the writing of Dr. Voss's final report, submitted in March 2025, no descendant has come forward to claim them. Marta Kremer, the sister, died in 1991. Her own family, 2 children, 3 grandchildren, now living in Regensburg and Munich, was contacted through channels coordinated by the German Federal Archives in December 2024. According to a brief statement made through their legal representative, the family acknowledges the historical findings and requests that their privacy be respected. They have no further comment. Those letters will sit in the archive, sealed envelopes addressed to a woman who has been dead for 30 years, from a brother she was officially told died in 1942, containing words she never read, written by a man who chose a different ending. There is something in that image, the letters that went nowhere, the archive that now holds them, the silence of the descendants who cannot quite close the distance between what they were told and what is now known, that speaks to the particular cruelty of secrets that are kept too long. Because secrets buried long enough begin to feel like facts. The family that grows up knowing their grandfather's brother died near Stalingrad does not grow up with a wound precisely shaped like Ernst Kremer's absence. They grow up with a story. And when the story changes, when the ground opens and reveals that the story was a construction, that a man stood in a surveyor's vest in front of a stone house in the Austrian lakes and watched the post-war world rebuild itself from a safe distance, the new knowledge is not necessarily comforting. It is simply true, and truth, when it arrives decades late, has a particular weight that is different from the truth that arrives on time. The Eisenkopf Ridge keeps its silence now the way it has always kept its silence. The pines grow back over the surveyed lines, the marked routes, the waypoints with their single-letter codes. The valley lies below, unchanged in the essential ways. The kite still circles overhead in the autumn light. But the mountain gave up its secret. After 83 years, the soil remembered what the steel and concrete and coated paper had preserved. The record of a man who understood the geometry of the hidden landscape better than anyone, who used that understanding to make himself into a point on a map that no one was looking at, and who lived out the remainder of his life somewhere between the person he had been and the person he had invented to survive. Sometimes the earth keeps secrets for decades, for generations, for lifetimes. It keeps them in steel safes behind blast doors on cold mountainsides in forests where no one walks. It keeps them in sealed envelopes and gold coins and identity papers in names that belong to no one. And then a radar sweep returns an anomaly, and a team of surveyors stands in a cold pine forest and looks at a readout on a tablet, and 83 years of silence end in a single morning. The question that lingers, the question that will linger as long as there are mountainsides we haven't surveyed and coastlines we haven't searched and archives we haven't opened, is not how this happened. The how is clear enough, now that we have looked. The question is, how many other observation posts are still out there, waiting for a radar signal that hasn't come yet? How many other logbooks are sealed behind doors that haven't rusted through? How many other letters are addressed to people who have been dead for 30 years, waiting in how many other safes for the morning when someone finally opens them? Ernst Wilhelm Kremer mapped the hidden landscape for a living. He spent his career making visible what concealment had hidden. In the end, he became his own most complete project, the most carefully hidden feature on the most carefully kept map, invisible for 83 years, discovered not because anyone was looking for him specifically, but because the landscape, in its patient and indifferent way, eventually shows you everything. It always does, it just takes time.